Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman. We're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess. I thought I'd do another video on counting. My first video did not really start at the basics, so in a sense I want to go back a little bit and start at the basics for counting. And I'd like to address a couple issues before I start. First, someone said, isn't counting just analysis? And the answer is no. Analysis is much more than counting. In fact, analysis includes looking for all possible tactics, and analysis includes a lot more than that. Analysis is simply calculating sequences of moves and creating that tree in your head of, if I go here and he goes there and I go there, what's going to happen? That's analysis. If you happen to be looking for a tactic, whether it be counting or double attacks or threats or whatever you're looking for, back rank mates, you're analyzing the position to see if there's a tactic. You could have a potential tactic that you're analyzing and it may or may not work out. That's the second thing I wanted to point out was counting is a tactic, but it's also part of analysis when it's not a tactic, just like every other failed tactic is part of analysis as well. Let's take an example. Examples are easier than trying to explain. Let's say here white wants to play a double attack, and he wants to play rook to d5. So in my brain, I visualize rook to d5, and I say, look, I have a double attack. I'm attacking two knights that are not guarded. But if you look further and you determine whether black has a defense to this, then black can play either knight to d4 or d6 and stop the tactic. So in this sense, the double attack is not a tactic in this sense. It's an attempted tactic, and it's part of your analysis to figure out that the double attack is not a tactic, it doesn't work, he has a defense. Counting is exactly the same thing. Counting is part of analysis. If you count whether there's a sequence of exchanges that wins material, and they don't, then you're just doing analysis, and your analysis determines that there's no tactic. But if a sequence of exchanges does win material, we need to give it a name, because a tactic is a forced sequence that wins material or checkmates. And as we've seen in the past, when people write tactics books, there's some tactics, like John Nunn wrote a book, Learn Chess Tactics, where he had some problems he called miscellaneous problems. And some of those miscellaneous problems were what I call counting problems, and I simply wanted to give it a name. So let's go back and let's do the basics on counting. Let's start with the very basics, which would be what happens if you count on one square only? Because counting includes all 64 squares of the board, just like any other tactic. But you want to start with one square just to make it simple. So let's start with a sequence that I show in my book, Every 1 Second Chess Book. And all we're going to do is look at the square d3 and determine if the black pawn is on d3 is safe. We're going to pretend that's the only tactical square of the board. We're going to put pieces all over the board, but we're only going to worry about d3. And in this position, if I say to you, is the pawn on d3 is safe, your analysis should tell you it's safe. There's no other pieces on the board that can capture it. This is not a counting issue. This is not a tactical issue. It's simply a pawn sitting on the board safely. All right, well, that's pretty easy. Let's start making it a little bit more complicated by adding things. So, whoops, I guess we should start by adding. Okay, let's add a rook to g3. And now it's white's turn. And the question is the pawn on d3 safe? We have a name for this. We call this en prise. En prise means that a piece is attacked at least once and not guarded at all. So this is the most simple type of counting you can get. There's two parts to the counting. One is that you have something attacked, and then you have to determine through the sequence of exchanges if it's safe. Well, en prise is as easy as it gets. It's attacked once. It's guarded 0 times. It's not safe. I can just take it off the board. Now, if I could play rook takes d3 and he's going to checkmate me somewhere else, then rook takes d3 is not safe. But we're trying to start with the easiest possible examples that we can, and we're only going to look at d3. Sure, there's always other things on the board. That's why I'm not putting the kings on the board. I just want you to concentrate on the d3 square. Okay, let's make it one step more difficult. These are all, of course, basic, easy things. This is what I teach kids when I'm teaching a class of first and second graders, and I'm trying to teach them to determine whether their pieces are safe. I start with these really, really basic counting examples. All right, so here again it's white's turn, and the rook is attacking d3 and a rook is defending it. And of course, everybody uses their values of the pieces here and says, wow, if white plays rook takes d3, he gets a pawn, but then black plays rook takes d3, he gets a rook. Rooks are worth more than pawns. If we want to use the Reinfeld values, it's 5-1. Therefore, white's not going to take the pawn. Therefore, my analysis, and it is analysis, of this counting is that the pawn is safe, which says that rook takes d3 is not a tactic here. In the previous example, rook takes d3 was a tactic. It was a counting tactic that was en prise, the most simple counting tactic. Here, we're using analysis to determine if d3 is safe, and it is. So our analysis tells us there's no tactic here, and the counting says that white would lose material if he takes on d3. All right, now we've added 2 attackers and 1 defender. Again, very easy stuff. Is the pawn on d3 safe? Well, if white plays rook takes d3, black has 2 choices. He can continue trading on d3, or he can just save his rook on d7. In either case, our analysis of our counting is going to show that this is a tactic, that white is winning material by force. Notice, we're winning material by force. If we hadn't used counting as a tactic, if we said counting's not a tactic, and we said white wins material here, what's the tactic? Well, it had no name. We could just say, well, he's just taking off a piece. Well, okay, but I decided I would give this a name, and I'm calling this a basic example of counting. Not the most complex example, but a basic one. So after rook on either takes d3, if black plays rook takes d3, rook takes d3, white will have won a rook and a pawn for a rook, which is winning a pawn. And if rook on either takes d3 and then black moves the rook away from d7, let's say rook to h7, then white again ends up ahead of pawn. Very, very easy stuff. All right, let's keep building it up. Okay, now there's 2 attackers and 2 defenders. Now you can't just count the number of attackers and number of defenders unless all the pieces that are capturing, like here, are the same value. That's a big mistake, because obviously you could have a queen that you could have a pawn could take a queen that could be guarded multiple times, and even if the pawn can't take back, you're still going to get a queen for a pawn or 2. So the number of times a piece is guarded versus is attacked is an important issue, but it's not the determining issue whether something is safe. So here, if rook takes d3, either rook, and black takes rook takes d3, white could save his rook, or he could continue to trade. But either way, he's going to end up down a rook for a pawn. So this is not a tactic. The analysis of the counting here determines that the pawn on d3 is safe, and therefore white would not take. Okay. Now we put a queen in behind, and we say, how about now? Can white still take, because now it's a queen involved? And the answer is no. He still can't take because the queen will take last. Let's put the queen on the diagonal. Suppose the queen is on b5 instead of here. Can white take now on d3? And the answer is no, because black has a choice here. He can still take first with the rook, and after rook takes d3, white's going to end up losing material. So this is not a tactic. Our analysis, same difference here. Our analysis is of the counting. We're counting on that d3 square, and we're determining that it's not safe to take. Okay, now we're going to put the queen in front of the rook. Now we actually have a real question. Is rook takes d3 safe? Well, if we use the Reinfeld values, where queens are worth 9 and pawns are worth 1, just for this simple example, then after rook takes d3, if the queen moves away, then it is a tactic, because white will end up a pawn ahead, and when you win material by force, then it would be a tactic. But of course it's not by force, because black doesn't have to just move his queen. He could take the rook on d3. So after rook either takes d3, queen takes d3, rook takes d3, rook takes d3, white has given up 2 rooks for a queen and a pawn, which according to Reinfeld values would be equal. If we use more sophisticated values, perhaps white has won a small amount of material, but by Reinfeld values, this is 10 to 10. So our analysis, in this case, our analysis of this counting example, would be that the pawn is safe and rook takes d3 is not a tactic if black knows enough to give up the queen for the 2 rooks. So here it's not as clear as it was before because the material that's being traded is very close. Queen and a pawn versus the two rooks. Okay, here's another one of those examples of if you take with the wrong piece, then it doesn't work. So our counting tells us that queen takes d3, rook takes d3, knight takes d3. White wins two things for one. He wins a rook and a pawn, but he's giving up a queen, and that's not good. But if he plays knight takes d3, then he wins a pawn. Is he winning more than a pawn? No, this isn't checkers. Black's rook on d8 doesn't have to take on d3. So after knight takes d3, black's simply not going to take on d3, and white wins a pawn. So this is a very basic counting tactic where knight takes d3 wins a pawn, queen takes d3 does not. And from black's standpoint, after knight takes d3, black's going to have to be happy with just losing the pawn. If he tries to get something for it, he's going to end up losing even more. Let's take one more example like this before we go to some more meaningful examples. Let's say white has a rook attacked on e6, and we're just going to count on e6 here. Okay, so what does our counting tell us here? Our counting tells us here that white can win the exchange by playing bishop takes e6, and if black takes back, white is, again, is what this chess is not checkers. White is not going to continue capturing on the e6 square. He'll simply stop while he's ahead, and after bishop takes e6, either f takes e6 or d takes e6, white is ahead. So our counting tells us take once, end up ahead, stop taking, and we win material. So here, this is, again, a very, very basic counting tactic on one square. Now, in the previous video, I gave several examples that involve multiple squares. Someone said, isn't this just a Desperado piece? And the answer is yes. Desperado pieces almost always lead to counting sequences, and we'll look at a couple. Let's look at one that's not a Desperado sequence. Let's get out number 20 here. Examine. Okay, so this is a game a student played a while ago, and this was in the previous video, but I just want to show the end of the sequence. Last time we looked at the whole sequence. So here, white attacked black's bishop on c5. And here black said, gee, he's attacking my bishop and I can't win that pawn on d4 because my knight on c6 is pinned. Maybe I can counterattack the bishop on b5 and play a6. And as we mentioned in the previous video, this is white to play and win material. Is this analysis? Absolutely. What are we analyzing? We're analyzing capturing sequences. What do I call analyzing capturing sequences to see if you win material? Well, it's counting. If it works, it's a tactic. If it doesn't work, you're still doing the counting, but it's not a tactic, just like every other tactic, as I said. So here, the mistake that black made is he only counted on two squares. He counted on c5 and b5, and he said if d takes c5, I'll play a takes b5, and I'm trading a bishop for a bishop. But the two squares he should have been counting on should not have been c5 and b5. It should have been c6 and c5. Because if white plays bishop takes c6 check, and we count on c6, we're going to get a fair trade on c6, but then white can capture on c5. So this is a very simple example, but it's also an example of a multi-square counting issue. If you just count on b5 and c5, then the move a6 looks safe. But if you correctly also count on c6 and c5, which is what white wants to do, white wants to play the sequence that helps him the most. And of course, black should look at that before he plays a6, which is not a safe move. White can play bishop takes c6 check, b takes c6, d takes c5, and the counting sequence on c6 and c5 wins material. Again, is that analysis? Absolutely, it's analysis. But what are we analyzing? We're analyzing capturing sequences. I'm just giving a name for that type of analysis. Just like if you analyzed a pin, let's say white plays e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight c6, bishop b5. Let's say black plays f6 or something silly. And now let's say we analyze d5 to see if this pin is a tactic. Can I win the knight with d5? Well, my analysis here of my potential pin should tell me that this is not a tactic. If I play d5, he can counterattack with a6. This has nothing to do with counting unless we're simply looking at what happens after d5, a6. But as far as the pin is concerned, this is a pin for sure. That knight can't move. It's an absolute pin. But d5 isn't really going to be a tactic. We're not going to win the knight with d5. So again, it's analysis. It's a pin. But this pin, in this case, is not a tactic. Just like we started the video with a double attack that turned out not to be a tactic. Okay, let's look at a couple more examples. In the Roy Lopez, I think we might have shown this one before also. After e5, e6, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castle, bishop e2, rook e1. If black castles, can white win a pawn? And the answer is yes. This is not a counting tactic. This is removal of the guard. Bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight takes e5. And in some lines, queen d4 wins the pawn back with a double attack on the knight and the pawn. But here, white can play knight f3, attacking the queen. So I often ask my students, what happens if black plays bishop g4 and tries to pin that knight? Is that a safe move? Well, the answer is counting here should tell you that it's not safe. What squares do we need to count on? We need to count on d4 and d1. So the capturing sequence on multiple squares here is knight takes d4, winning a queen, bishop takes d1, winning the queen back, and rook takes d1, winning the bishop. So white ends up winning a piece by the counting sequence, knight takes d4, bishop takes d1, rook takes d1. Simple, but we got to give it a name because it's white to play and win a piece. It's not a double attack. It's not a fork. It's simply a counting sequence. I'm just giving these things names. Okay, let's look at a couple more. Number 208. Okay, so black has just played h6. And the question is that a safe move? How would you determine that? Well, you have to analyze the position. What are you going to analyze? You're going to analyze capturing sequences. Well, let's look at a capturing sequence where white takes on g4. If white plays bishop takes g4, black's not going to necessarily play knight takes g4. What he's going to do is play h takes g5. If he played knight takes g4, that wouldn't be as good. Then white could play bishop takes e7. But h takes g5 is simply counting on g4 and g5 and saying that's okay. But is that the only capturing sequence that we can look at? The answer is no. White has other captures. For instance, the bishop that's endangered can take on f6. This is what we talked about at the start of the video. This is now what's called a Desperado situation. Once white takes on f6 and removes the guard, the bishop on g4 is hanging. So it would be a removal of the guard tactic if black simply plays bishop takes f6 and white plays bishop takes g4. But black doesn't have to fall for the removal of the guard. He can continue to capture bishop takes e7. And now if white captures, bishop takes e2. And if white captures on e2 with king takes, queen takes, or knight takes, black will capture on f6 and be even. So here we have this continued Desperado sequence where white would then play bishop takes e7. Okay, so now what does black do? White's attacking his queen. Black has two choices. If he plays queen takes e7, white can play queen e2 and remain up a knight. If he plays bishop takes d1, though, white will play bishop takes d8 and continue to capture the queen. We've got these Desperado sequences. These can be very, very complicated to calculate. This one's not so complicated, but it's not trivial either. I've certainly seen my intermediate students mess up on these kind of calculations. So now black has a choice. He can save the bishop on d1, but then white will save the bishop on d8. or black can take the bishop on d8, in which case white will take the bishop on d1. And in either case, white's going to end up a piece ahead through this Desperado sequence, which is, by my definition, a more complex type of counting sequence. So let's go through this one again. Black has just played h6. If white plays bishop takes g4, black will simply play h takes g5 and trade a piece for a piece. So white can try bishop takes f6, and now bishop takes f6 simply loses a piece to bishop takes g4. If black's going to try to stay equal, he needs to look at bishop takes e2. And now again, white should not capture on e2 just because his queen is attacked. He should counterattack the queen with bishop takes e7. If black takes queen takes e7, then let's say queen takes e2 leaves him up a piece. But unfortunately for black, if bishop takes d1, bishop takes d8. And if now black saves his bishop, white will save his bishop. If black captures the bishop, white will capture the bishop. And either way, white stays up a piece. So that tells us through this counting sequence, through these desperados, that h6 was not a safe move for black. He should have just played, let's say, bishop takes e2 instead. All right, I think we have one last example, number 212. Okay, so this is white to play, and white thinks that he has a tactic. He thinks he has a discovered attack on the bishop on f4, and what he wants to do is move the knight to check black so that if black takes back with the pawn on f5, white can play queen takes f4, and he's traded a knight for a bishop, but he's opened up the black king. So therefore, white plays knight f5 check, trying to do that. And he says, well, if black moves the king, I'll take the bishop. But if he takes my knight with the pawn, I'll take his bishop, and I'll open up his king that way. So this becomes black to play, and the question is, what should black do? He can't play bishop takes d2 because he's in check. But this is actually another counting tactic, because black has several possible moves to get out of check. He's got the king move, which of course allows queen takes f4, and then black would have to play g takes f5 to get his piece back anyway. He's got g takes f5, which allows queen takes f4, trading the bishop for the knight and opening up the king. But it's the other move that looks impossible at first glance that's the right counting move, and that is black should play queen takes f5. It looks like, why would he want to do that? There's a pawn guarding the knight. But notice the white queen is completely unguarded on d2. If white now plays g takes f4, then black has bishop takes d2, and black ends up winning a piece. But if white plays queen takes f4, the queen that was in take by the pawn on g4 can recapture on f4, and now black's up an entire queen. So what this tells us is that the attempted discovered attack tactic, knight f5, and you could say it's not a tactic, it's just a maneuver to open up the black king, because if black plays pawn takes knight and white plays queen takes f4, black can play f takes g4, and he's not losing material. So, we could call this sort of a mini tactic, or we could call it a maneuver. It's just a matter of semantics. There is no official dictionary of chess that would tell us what we want to call this if black plays it wrong and takes the knight with the pawn. But we need a name for how black can win material here if he plays it correctly. And my name for this, as we know from this video and the previous ones, now becomes a counting problem once white has played knight f5 check. And if black counts correctly, he will play queen takes f5, and now all the capturing sequences favor him. If white does nothing here and saves his queen, black will just save his queen also, and black will have won the knight. If white takes the queen, then black will take the queen. G takes f5, bishop takes d2, and black's up a piece. And finally, the last counting sequence is, if white says, well, you took my piece, I'll take your piece, black says, oh yes, but I can save my queen and take yours, and now I'm not just up a piece, I'm up an entire queen. But that's every single possible sequence after queen f5. White really only has either save the queen or capture his queen or capture his bishop. He could throw in, rook takes rook first. That won't really change things very much, but I guess we have to consider that as well. But in any case, here, queen takes f5. If I say black to play and win, and you correctly find the move queen takes f5, and I say, what tactic is that you just played? Well, it's not a pin, it's not a double attack, it's really just a counting sequence. And what squares are you counting on? You're counting on f5, you're counting on f4, you're counting on d2, and you're determining that you're coming out ahead. Is this analysis? Absolutely. We're analyzing a capturing sequence, just like you would analyze any other tactic. Okay, so today we went back to basics. We showed a sequence of captures on d3 with a black pawn that you could use for teaching any kids class. But then we kind of expanded on there and talked about analysis, counting, what makes something a tactic, when you're analyzing something and it's not a tactic. We're just talking a little bit about semantics. There's no official dictionary of chess, but these are the definitions that I use to describe these kind of situations. And if you don't want to use my definitions, that's quite okay. As long as you use consistent ones, that's all right. When I'm teaching people, I try to come up with things that describe things that I might not already have a name for. Just like Charles Hertan used that idea of sneaky pins, I came up with the idea of hope chess or counting to describe certain things that had no name that I was trying to teach. Okay, I hopefully enjoyed today's video. If it was too basic for you, maybe you can use it when you're teaching someone else. It's a good video for teaching beginners, at least the first 10 minutes of this video. And hopefully this clarifies some matters that were raised in my first video about counting. I probably should have done these two videos in reverse order. Apologize for that, but what's done is done. Well, hopefully you enjoyed it. And I did get 1,000 subscribers. Thanks to all the subscribers out there. We are going to be giving out at least one free lesson. If I get a lot of people applying for the free lesson, I might give out maybe 2 free lessons. We'll see how many people apply. But I'm asking people to email me, telling me that they're a subscriber and telling me that they'd like to apply for the free lesson. It's open till tomorrow night. And if you don't know how to email me, just go to my website, danheisman.com. Click on email Dan in the text, or click on the email icon at the top of the page and send me an email. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.